to our next presentation from Britney Craig from California State University at Dominguez Hills. Her paper is entitled Theoretical Argument for Raising Liberated Black Boys, Contribution toward an Embodied Pedagogy of Childhood. I love the title. Thank you. Take it away, Britney.
Thank you so much. So my name is Britney. I study sociology at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and outside of my formal education, I have a background in grassroots community organizing in the LA area. So I'm eager to show some highlights of my ethnographic and theoretical paper. Next slide. While watching a documentary about the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black boy who was murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman, with my son, he noticed parallels between the relationship of Emmett Till and his mother and our relationship. She was raising a free Black boy. I'm raising a free Black boy. Next slide. On the day of this reflection, my 10-year-old son, Emmanuel, and I decided to visit a park in downtown LA. During this trip, Emmanuel was determined to ride his scooter through the park, despite posted rules stating that this activity was forbidden. In spite of my own discomfort and fears, I engaged my son in a dialogue where we both concluded that the rules didn't make any sense. Emmett Till and Emmanuel share common experiences as Black boys whose quest for liberation come into direct conflict with the spoken and unspoken rules governing Black people in the US. Next slide. How is it that African Americans were supposedly liberated from slavery over 150 years ago, yet a struggle against racial oppression remains at the forefront of public discourse and community organizing efforts? Next slide. While there are well-documented institutional and systemic factors that heavily contribute to this reality, the purpose of this study was to identify the power Black families have in liberating themselves from racial oppression. In my essay, I demonstrate how historically rooted child-rearing norms perpetuate racial subjugation. I argue that African American families can transform themselves into sites of transgenerational healing and liberation by developing pedagogical practices that center and elevate the ontological position of Black children. Next slide. Black children, and especially Black boys, are subject to rigid expectations dictating their behavior, emotional expression, and speech. These and other prescriptions of Black childhood emerged as obstacles meant to limit my son's experience of personhood, and I was expected to enforce them. It was in the contradiction of my intentions to protect my son's autonomy and the expectation that I do the opposite that I came to the object of study for this research. Next slide. The oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. Freedom will require them to eject this image and replace it with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is not an ideal located outside man. It's rather the indispensable condition for the quest for human completion. Paulo Freire. Next slide. During my research process, Dr. DeGroy's theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome was instrumental in articulating the historical and social standpoints of Black parents. According to this theory, African Americans adopted behaviors and practices meant to protect themselves and their loved ones from the trauma of slavery and ongoing oppression under racial capitalism. Over time, these behaviors and practices have lost their utility and have become maladaptive. African American parenting practices replicate many slavery-era norms. Next slide. Generations after slavery, fear of white supremacist backlash motivates Black parents to whip their kids so the police don't have to. Tearful Black boys are demanded to be a man and suck it up. Inquisitive youths are told to stay in a child's place. Protests punished with a pop to the mouth of smart-mouthed kids. These experiences teach children that they don't have the right to discover themselves through thought, action, and dialogue. Next slide. Despite these supposedly protective measures, Black men are 2.5 times as likely as white men to be killed by police. In healthcare settings, Black women's pain is dismissed. The list of disparities goes on and on. Parenting practices that epistemically exclude Black children are inimical to liberation. Next slide. Epistemic injustice occurs when a group of people is prevented from contributing to collective knowledge due to a bias from the dominant group. When a group of people is excluded from knowledge production, the status quo goes unchallenged. Epistemic exclusion prevents critical questions from being asked and perspectives from being shared. Without critical dialogue, social change can't happen. Next slide. Emerging research on childhood epistemic injustice focuses on children's experiences within systems like healthcare, social welfare, and education, largely without accounting for race. They almost never acknowledge epistemic injustice in the home, where biases against children prevent them from being invited into meaningful discussions. Black children are epistemically oppressed because they're systematically excluded from knowledge production based on both race outside of the home and age within it. In my paper, I cite the lack of literature censoring the experiences of Black children as evidence of this limiting practice. This process alienates them from their right to act on their social worlds. Next slide. According to Freire, oppression is a historical process. In order to become liberated, oppressed people must become aware of and act against the historical processes that subjugate them. While it may appear that Black parents are the oppressors of Black children, the prior application of de Groy's theory reveals that both parent and child are subjugated by the system of racial capitalism. By recognizing this process of oppression, Black parents can remove themselves from the position of sub-oppressors of their children and act as allies, next slide, in their children's quest for liberation and self-determination. This allyship requires the recognition that as adults who have been deeply entrenched in justification for their oppression, parents must trust their children to guide liberative dialogue and action. It requires a reframing of the parent-child relationship and the distribution of power within it, similar to Freire's teacher-student model, which leads with the assumption that students are rational actors capable of critical thought. Expanding on Freire's critical pedagogy, my research invites parents to recall their childhood experiences and how they felt in order to serve as more empathetic and connected allies with their children. Through critical dialogue, the child challenges the internal contradictions of the parent, presenting the parent with the opportunity for critical self-reflection. At the same time, the child sees himself contributing to change in their social world. Through an ongoing process of radical dialogue, critical self-reflection, and action, both parents and children are liberated from the internalized racial capitalist assumptions about themselves and the world around them, which have been passed down through generations. Next slide. While my research is in its infancy, my hope is that other Black researchers and parents are inspired into dialogue and collaboration with children to develop pedagogical processes that liberate Black children and thereby Black people from the grips of racial oppression. Because love is an act of courage, not of fear. Love is a commitment to others. No matter where the oppressed are found, the act of love is commitment to their cause, the cause of liberation. And I would like to close my presentation with a quote from my 10-year-old son when asked, "What does freedom mean?" His response, "Being free means no slavery and being able to express your feelings and being able to play and not being controlled." And when I asked him, "What does freedom look like?" he responded, "It looks like my life." Next slide. Here's a list of my citations. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Brittany, for that